So, hello, I am Alex. My partner in crime, Catherine O'Brien, is on vacation this week, but the two of us host the Middlebury Science Cafe on the second Thursday of every month. We host a speaker, we come hang out, talk about science. The speaker couldn't make it, unfortunately, this week, so you are now stuck with me, which means I have the pleasure of introducing myself. So, I am Alex, and I thought it would be cool if I started off by pointing at a picture of me, pointing at a picture of who I am. I received my PhD in statistics from the University of Georgia, go Dogs, in 2017. I am currently employed as an assistant professor at Middlebury College, and while I may not look like it, this is actually my 11th year teaching, so I've been teaching for quite a while, 7th at college. And I'm also the associate director of Mid-Data, which is an initiative at Middlebury College to make data literacy as fundamental to a college education as reading and writing and arithmetic. We believe that students need to know how to deal with data, and that doesn't mean that everyone needs to become a data scientist or a computer scientist, but that when you're trying to solve challenging problems about history or sociology, oftentimes it's going to involve dealing with data, and that's what my talk can be about today. I'm going to sort of pull from 3 different examples of data-driven research projects from across the sciences. With the first being about my use of eye tracking data, looking at gaze data, or how people look at a screen, which I'll talk more about in a second. I'm going to look at some X, formerly Twitter, data on US drone strikes in Yemen and how Yemeni citizens responded to those drone strikes in their hometowns on Twitter. And finally, I'm going to sort of finish with some healthcare data looking at NICU data on necrotizing enterocolitis, which I'll explain when I get there. So that's my goal today. I want to convince you that we can use data to do some really cool things across the sciences. And I'm going to start by highlighting my eye tracking data. I want to give a big shout out to my collaborator, Lonneke Bols, who works at Hoge Street Utrecht, which is a school in Utrecht in the Netherlands. So, I'm going to start us off by asking us a little question here. So, no pressure. I'm showing you 2 graphs. Here we have exam scores for Class A and for Class B. Give me a second to look at these. I'm asking you a simple question. Which class had a higher variation in exam scores? Class A or Class B? Give me a couple seconds. I'm going to make you raise your hand. All right, no pressure. Raise your hand if you think Class A had higher variation in exam scores. 6. I see 7. Raise your hand for Class B. 1. Raise your hand for approximately the same. I see 1. Somehow we have 7, 1, 1, and then a whole bunch of not willing to raise their hand. Come on in. Don't worry, I got 7 questions just for you guys. All right, 7, 1, 1. The answer is, of course, Class B. Class B, well done. Class B has much, much, much higher variation in exam scores. Now, why is that? Well, what we have here are 2 bar charts, and on the x-axis we have the exam scores. So a 0 is bad, and a 10 is good. And on the y-axis we have frequency, or how many students in that class scored that number on the exam. So for example, in Class A, if I look at 5, 12 students scored a 5 in Class A. 10 students scored a 4. So in fact, actually most students in Class A scored about half on the exam. Whereas in Class B, students scored all over the place. There were 8 students who scored a 10, perfect score, 7 students who scored a 0, they got none of them right. So there's actually a lot more variation in the exam scores in Class B. And now the deceptive thing here is, there's a lot more variation in the heights of the bars in Class A. And so when you see variation, you're drawn to, oh, like, these are all different, they vary, and these are all the same. They don't vary. And that's true, but that's not how these kinds of graphs are representing data. Okay, I got one more for you. 2 more graphs. Here we have weights of collected garbage. Here we have weights of packages. And my question now for you is, in which graph is the average weight higher? Take a second. All right, raise your hand if you think the average weight is higher in the left graph. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 again. Raise your hand if you think the average weight is higher in the right graph. Back to 7 and 1 again. And now raise your hand if you think they're about the same. 1, 2, 3. It's changing. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, we'll call it 7, 0, and 4. Some of you still not raising your hands. The answer is, of course, Class A this time. Why do I say that? Well, here we have what's called a case value bar chart. That means on the x-axis we have different cases, different names. These are Dutch names, which is why they look so not familiar. And on the y-axis we have the weight of how much garbage they collected. So here we have Joram. Joram collected 9 kilograms of garbage. This bar represents one case, one single value. But here we have what's called a histogram. This represents the aggregation of lots of values. For example, between 4 and 5, the bar is at height 18. There's a frequency of 18, meaning there are 18 packages in between 4 and 5 kilograms. So two graphs that visually look essentially identical, but this graph is actually representing individual garbage collections, and each bar here represents the aggregation of many, many, many packages. And so it turns out the average weight of garbage is somewhere around 8. And the average weight of packages is somewhere around 4.5. See how to get that in a second. And why do I do this? Well, I do this because graphs are confusing. They're really hard to understand even when they're explained to you. You might say, well, Alex, if graphs are so confusing and you're a teacher, why don't you just teach better? Then they won't be so confusing. And unfortunately what we see is, if you dedicate an entire week, an entire section to teaching students how to read a graph, and then you test them on it the next week, they actually do pretty well. And then you test them on it 3 weeks later, and they know nothing. It's like they've forgotten everything, and they fall back into all of the same traps that you potentially just fell into when I asked you those questions. And so as an instructor and as a statistics education researcher, I want to try to figure out why, how we can fix this. But I want to convince you that if you got this wrong, and most of you did, you're not alone. So students often assume every graph with bars is a bar chart. Meaning, for the majority of students, they see bars and they assume each bar is an individual case, an individual value. But it's not just students. We asked essentially these exact same questions to teachers, and in this particular study, about 2/3 of primary and secondary school math teachers made the same mistakes. They got the same 2 questions wrong. They identified histograms as bar charts. They identified everything as a bar chart. So it's not just students, it's teachers too. And as I sort of mentioned a couple of times, the most prevalent misconception here, again, is that each bar represents an individual data value. So I want to figure out how to change that. And that's what this research does. So I have my formal research question here, which is pretty long. Actually, first, before I show you my research question, I want to talk about how I think we're going to fix it. And the answer is, oops, turns out I have no idea what slide is next. I'll come back to this. I have this histogram slide here. And my goal is to make people understand, hey, when you're looking at a histogram, this bar represents an aggregation of values. As I mentioned, just telling students that makes them remember it for a couple of weeks, and then they forget it. So how can I help them discover that themselves in a more organic way? And here we go. How can a machine learning algorithm quantify differences in students' gaze data, the way they look at a graph, when they interpret 2 nearly identical histograms with dot plot tasks in between? All right, a long sentence, so I'm going to break this down. I'm going to show students 2 nearly identical histograms. 2 graphs, they're going to look almost exactly the same. But I'm not going to show them at the same time. I'm going to show them at 2 separate times. And in between, I'm going to give them a dot plot. And a dot plot looks like this. A dot plot is just a histogram, but instead of showing the bar as an aggregation of points, it actually shows the points. It shows the dots. So it's the same way to display data, but instead of with a bar, we're doing it with individual dots. The idea here is that maybe by seeing the data displayed in some different way, that might key students into, maybe this bar is kind of the same as this stack of dots. It's like a bunch of packages all stacked up. We'll see. So I'm going to show them two histograms with a dot plot task in between, and I'm going to look at their gaze data, the way that they parse through the graph. I'm going to track that with a high-powered camera, and I'm going to use some fancy machine learning to tell me about how they're looking at these graphs. I want to know, if I show you two graphs, and I put some embedded learning task in between, does that change the way you look at the same graph the second time? Let's find out. Here's why I'm doing this. When you have a histogram, and I say, hey, find the average, find the mean, the way you do it visually is you say, okay, I kind of want to find the balancing point, the fulcrum of this distribution. Meaning the average, the mean, is kind of like the point where this distribution would balance on. And in order to do that, you kind of have to look and think vertically. Like, is the average here? Oh, it's too far to the right. Is the average here? Nah, too much of the weight is on the right side. So you have to sort of look up and down. But when calculating the average for a case value bar chart, since each bar represents a single case, you're essentially just saying, okay, what's the average of the number 1, and 9, and 8, and 7? And so you can kind of think it like if you turned your head sideways and found the middle of all of the heights of the bars. That's the average on a bar chart. And so students thinking like this, trying to calculate an average like this, might be looking or gazing at the graph in a more horizontal way. That's sort of the theory. So we'll see in practice. To give you some quick background of the study in case you care, we took 50 participants at a public secondary school in the Netherlands. They ranged from about 15 to 19, and we gave them a little bit of money to participate. The students did a bunch of different graphing tasks, which I could talk forever about, but I'm just going to highlight two today. Students completed this on a laptop with a ridiculously expensive Tobii eye tracker, like $12,000 or something. Gets really high-quality data of where students are looking on the screen. We had them do some calibration to make sure every student has eyes at different locations, and they stand at a slightly different place away from the screen, and they drift their eyes in a different way. So we calibrated each time. We used a chin rest to sort of make them stop moving their heads so that we could get sort of the angles right. And in case you're interested, we have about a 7% average data loss, which means as we're taking snapshots 60 times a second, we have almost perfect data. So we're losing about 1 in every 20 or so snapshots. Quite good. Tons and tons and tons of data. Here's what we showed them. A histogram that looks like this. The original tasks are in Dutch, so you'll see sometimes the English translation, sometimes the Dutch. We gave them another task about 15 minutes later that looked like this. And for the machine learning purposes, what I'm going to do is essentially flip this. I'm going to mirror this task, and I'm going to remove all the axes and just focus on the way students looked at the graphing area. Meaning I didn't want to show them the exact same two histograms with all the same labels because they might go, hey, I've seen this before. So I'm going to show them essentially the same graph, just mirrored, and then when I'm doing all of my math, I'm going to flip the XY coordinates. So the structure is we show them this graph. Here are some dot plots to maybe get you thinking about something, and then we show them a second graph. Let's see what happens. The data look like this. You have to squint your eyes just to see what's happening, but here we have tons and tons of columns, and obviously I couldn't fit it on the screen, something like 400 different columns of data, where each row represents a snapshot in time, 1/60th of a second, and each column represents something we're measuring. And this includes everything like we look at where your eyes are located, where your left eye is looking, where your right eye is looking, because it turns out they don't always match. And so we have X, Y pixel coordinates on the screen of where your eyes are looking. Tons of information that you might want to know. But if you really boil it down to just the interesting part for today, we kind of only have two columns. We have an X and a Y. Meaning yeah, there's lots of cool, interesting stuff, but let's just figure out where is the student looking on the screen. How can that tell me something about how they're reading this graph? So if you visualize the data, you might see something like this. If I actually plot those points on the graph, where each of these little purple circles here is what we call a fixation point. It's a single location that a student spends some predetermined amount of time looking at. Meaning, if you're looking at, let's say, the number 18, you're not going to look at the exact same pixel for 5 seconds, because that's sort of impossible, but you're going to be looking at a reasonable neighborhood for a certain amount of time, and so that's what we define a fixation point to be, sort of looking at a certain time. From a more physics-y standpoint, the way we really do it is we measure sort of the velocity of how their eyes are moving, and if their velocity is below a certain threshold, then we say they're fixating at a certain point. So these little pink points here are different points of fixation, and they're actually numbered in order. Not that you could really tell because this student keeps going back and forth between these two spots in the graph. And these little lines between points of fixation are what we call saccades, rapid eye movements between places where they're fixating on the graph. And the whole point of this analysis is to see, can we change the way students gaze or look at graphs? Presumably, in the way that they're also interpreting them, just by maybe showing them a dot plot. Let's find out. Here are all of the saccade data for all the students looking at the histogram before, so that first histogram, and all the students looking at the histogram after the dot plot. I've centered them all at the origin, so they're all sort of just pointing out in the direction. Take a look at these, and see if you can visually see, is there a difference in these gaze patterns? Is there a difference in the saccade data for all the students looking at the first histogram versus the second histogram? There's a lot going on. Anybody see something different they're willing to point out? What do you see, CJ?
On the after, like the change in the y coordinate kind of occurs more frequently.
Yeah. So if you look here, so CJ is pointing at change in y coordinate. That means how vertically are they looking versus how horizontally they're looking. And so what CJ is saying is, hey, if I look over here in the after data, it seems like I see a lot more big changes in y, a lot more saccades looking up. And in fact, if you look at the before, they're kind of all really small. All of these vertical facing saccades are pretty small. There's also kind of a mirrored version down here. Like it seems like students are really gazing up and down a lot more often after versus before. Now, it's not a very quantitative assessment, but visually it looks like something has changed. And realistically, only about 15 minutes have passed since the first time they saw a histogram and the second time they saw the histogram. And we haven't said anything to them. We didn't prompt them in any way. We didn't interpret anything in the questions. They are all by themselves looking at a screen. But something about their gaze has changed. So that's interesting. Can we quantify it? So now you have to bear with me. I'm going to get a little bit technical. I'm going to try and keep us along. So I'm going to use what's called a random forest to try and classify, to try and predict. When I'm looking at some gaze data, when I'm looking at saccades, fixation points, is this the first time that a student has seen a histogram? Or is it their second time? Because if I can train some fancy random forest algorithm to predict, oh yeah, this is obviously the first time, or oh yeah, this is obviously the second time, then that means he's picked up on something that makes it clear, oh yeah, it's the first time, or the second time, because something has changed. And if I can train an algorithm to pick that out, then there must be some sort of difference there. And if there's a difference, something must have happened between the first time they saw their graph and the second time they saw their graph. So, the features for this forest include the number of saccades in a given direction with a given magnitude, which is a fancy way of saying I'm going to take us back to pre-calculus, and I'm going to code every saccade, so every rapid eye movement, in terms of its cardinal direction. So is it between east and northeast, or northeast and north, or north and northwest, or gradients if you're more familiar with that. And I'm going to code it in terms of its magnitude. Is it between 50 and 100 pixels, 100 and 200, 200 and 400? So I'm going to code basically a saccade that looks like this, So, and a saccade that looks like this as the same thing. I'm putting them into bins to reduce some of the noise. It also makes the computation a little bit easier. So that's the goal. In order to understand how a random forest works, you have to understand how a decision tree works. So let me explain how a decision tree algorithm works. It's a fancy machine learning algorithm designed to make predictions. And what it does is it says, let's take our data, which starts off as 50 before histograms and 50 after histograms. And the goal is to find some saccade, maybe this way, maybe that way, that if I see that, if I see a lot of that saccade, will separate the data into, oh, this is the first time, or oh, this is the second time you've seen this particular graph. Because if it can do that, then I can learn, oh man, when they're looking at it the first time, they keep going like this. But when they look at it the second time, they keep going like this. And then I can investigate why that might be happening. So this is what the decision tree does. I'm going to sort of anthropomorphize it a little bit. It's going to say, let me just pick a random kind of saccade. So let's say I pick between 0 and pi over 4, which on a cardinal direction is between east and northeast. So saccades facing this direction. Let's just take that, well, with a magnitude between 200 and 400 pixels on the screen. Let's just try that. And what a decision tree does is it picks a random number. So let's just say I choose 5. And it's going to say, let me find all of the gaze data where I see more than 5 examples of this kind of saccade. And then let me find all the gaze data, everything else, where I see fewer than 5 of that particular kind of saccade. And let me see if that's a good way to split my data into before and after histogram data. And there's a little toy example where I made up the numbers. We see that on the left-hand side, if I find all of the data that contain at least 5 of this kind of saccade, wow, 44 of them belong to my before histogram data, and 8 of them belong to my after histogram data. I've gone from a 50-50 split to now almost entirely the first time they've seen the graph. And if I look at the other side, I see the same thing in the opposite direction. Wow, students who had fewer than 5 saccades, almost all that data belongs to the after, or the second time they saw the graph. So what does this mean? Well, this means that I can use this kind of decision tree to say, hey, this kind of saccade, if I see a lot of it, that seems indicative of being the first time you've seen this graph. And if I don't see a lot of it, then that seems indicative of the second time that you've seen this graph. And it's not perfect. It splits my data into about 86% accurately. But it gives me, the researcher, some intuition about, hey, something's going on here. This is changing. They used to have a lot of these saccades the first time they looked at it, and now they don't. So that's the goal here. I made it way simpler than it actually is because this algorithm isn't picking totally randomly, it picks kind of intelligently. But the idea is, I'm going to do this not just for this very specific kind of saccade, but all combinations of saccades, and see how I can break apart the data. And it turns out that what I'm actually building is called a random forest, which is a whole bunch of decision trees put together, but it's not a big deal. Just know that the algorithm is built in the way I just described, but there's actually a whole bunch of trees all making different predictions. Here are the results. This model is, most importantly, 80% accurate. So what that means is, if you take all of the students' gaze data and you shuffle it all up, and you give me their XY coordinates for a particular task they worked on, 80% of the time, I can tell you, really this algorithm can tell you, is it the first time they've seen it, or the second time they've seen it? Which is pretty powerful, because it's the same graph. They've just seen it 15 minutes apart. How is it so accurate? Well, here's the sort of super fancy output, so those familiar with machine learning can look at this and see, the most important feature is saccades in the 3 pi over 2 to 7 pi over 4 or south by southeast direction of this magnitude. So if this means something to you, then cool. I'm going to show you a visualization that's going to make clear how is this model so accurate. And the answer is these green saccades are much, much, much more prevalent in the after, the second time data, and these blue saccades are much more prevalent, proportionally, in the before data. Meaning before, students are making lots of these horizontal, slightly vertical motions with their eyes, but the second time they look at the graph, they're making these large, vertical, slightly horizontal motions. It's changed significantly. Now, where this research currently is we actually interviewed these students afterwards and asked them, hey, tell me about your strategies for solving this. We're still working through that data, and it's in Dutch, so I actually don't speak Dutch, and so it's kind of hard for me to make progress in that particular way. So all we have is knowing that their gaze patterns have changed, and the only thing that changed, the only thing that passed, is 15 minutes of time and viewing a dot plot. So we've reasonably limited what could possibly be causing this change, but we're now analyzing the interview data to better understand what were students thinking. Did they take a different strategy? Why is their gaze data changing? So some of the implications of this could be, as you're working on a homework assignment at home, you have a webcam, assuming you haven't blocked it off and allow access to it. Imagine that you're working on a homework question, and this machine learning algorithm says, I can tell that Kira is misinterpreting this histogram. I can see, based on her gaze patterns, she's making a lot of these horizontal saccades. I know that that's a wrong strategy for reading a histogram. I'm just going to pop up a little thing that says, hey, you might be misinterpreting what this graph is saying. And so, actually, here's some links, or here's some material on how to read a histogram. Something like that. If you're super nefarious, you could imagine this kind of technology being used by advertisers to say, hey, I see you looking at an ad. Ooh, that person looked at the ad in a way where there's no way they actually read the content. So I'm going to pay the website less money, knowing that the user, there's no way they actually saw the brand name, or they didn't actually look at the link in a way that they could have understood it, so I'm going to pay less money. I'm not particularly interested in that kind of application, but just know that I do this with graphs. There's a million other sort of uses for this kind of work. So I'm just going to shift gears now to a more sort of social context, and I'm going to talk about how we can use similar quantitative approaches to looking at how Yemeni citizens respond to US drone strikes on Twitter, now X. I'm going to keep using Twitter, if only because the research we did was a snapshot in time back when this was Twitter, and the landscape has changed quite a bit. So there's no guarantee the results I'm about to show you might generalize to sort of the current X platform and the way that it works. In particular, we have two research questions that we're going to tackle. One is, how do drone strikes shape the way citizens of Yemen talk about the US on Twitter? And how does Twitter activity change in response to US drone strikes in Yemen? Are there spikes in lots of tweets? Are there changes in the sentiment or the characteristics of the tweets based on the characteristics of the strikes? Do strikes with lots of fatalities in a person's hometown change discourse on Twitter? I'm going to give a big shout out to two Middlebury students who helped with this, Violet Ross and Evan Weiss. This is really Evan's brainchild. They're both juniors. They did an awesome job, and so I'm going to highlight some of the things that we all found here. This is us doing the Vermonster Challenge up in Burlington, and Evan was the MVP here. I have never seen someone so skinny eat 14 scoops of ice cream when the rest of us had already tapped out. So, props to Evan. This all started from Evan reading this particular article, which, if you get a chance, I highly recommend. It's called From Arizona to Yemen, The Journey of an American Bomb. And it follows a bomb being created at a plant in Arizona, tracking it to where it was ultimately dropped, I believe just outside of Sana'a in Yemen. And it really tells the story of the effect that these drones have, not immediately by hopefully killing the intended target, but on the surrounding people and their sense of safety and community. Right? Even if you drop a bomb that kills nobody, you have now signaled to the people living in that area, hey, if you congregate in any way, you could be a target of one of these bombs from a drone that you can't see, that you can't hear, and it's terrifying. And this article does a really good job talking about that. So I encourage you to read it if you get a chance. Why you should care about this kind of research? Well, since 2002, the US has used at least 336 air and drone strikes. And I say that because, unsurprisingly, the US government does not publish a nice database of all of the times that they have launched drone strikes, but there are lots of nonprofits around that collect and collate data with sort of reasonable sourcing. So we kind of use a conglomeration of those for our data. So we know it's at least 300-something drone strikes. 1,000 people have been killed, again, confirmed at least from drone strikes, including about 200 civilian targets. There's tons of warring factions. The Yemeni civil war is super complex, and so I'm not even going to try and dive into it, but just know that there's the Houthi movement, the Yemeni government, AQAP, then there's sort of proxies of Iran and Saudi Arabia and the US, and sort of this quagmire of tons of foreign politics at play here. Today, 23 million Yemenis need humanitarian assistance. Many of this will sort of surface on Twitter. And although there's been extensive research done on the impact of drone strikes for individuals, there really, before us, hadn't been any research on how people were talking about this on social media. How did this sort of manifest in the social sphere? That's what this research is going to do. Now, getting the tweets involved us using Twitter's API, which for academics used to be free. So I say was here because, unfortunately, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, almost immediately he cut off all academic access to Twitter. He's running his business, he's got to make money. It used to be free, which was nice. It's not anymore, it's unbelievably expensive. In fact, the data we collected would cost, I ran it, something like $50 million if I were to try and ask for it today. So it is what it is, which is my way of saying this was a platform that we got the tweets. And so we got things like the tweet, retweets, who the user was, who they followed, likes, everything you could possibly want to know. We searched for all tweets that mentioned anything even sort of remotely related to the Yemeni civil war, including AQAP or any of the locations of the strikes themselves. And we used a Google language API, which is basically just fancy paid for Google Translate, to translate all the non-English tweets, which were mostly Arabic, but some other languages. So it's worth noting that the caveat here is we did some spot checking, so we partnered with a couple of people who spoke Arabic fluently, but we have something like 3 billion tweets, so they did not read 3 billion tweets. They read a subset and said, yeah, translation in context seems totally reasonable. So this is all based on translated tweets. Here's what the data looked like. Again, super tiny, lots of columns here, where each row represents a tweet. We got billions of them. But I'm going to break this down into just the one column we really care about today, which is the actual text content of the tweet. So you can read a couple of these. These are all different tweets about the Yemeni civil war in some kind of way. And this is kind of small. It's kind of hard to maybe read up here. So I want to sort of focus or highlight a couple of users in particular that I found were both impactful but also pretty representative of the kinds of discourse you might see on Twitter from Yemeni citizens. It's worth noting that we used a combination of geocoding data and other biography data to sort of identify when users were citizens of Yemen or living in Yemen as opposed to Americans or people living in some other country. So here's Soraya al-Muslimi. He is a Yemeni citizen who worked and did school in the US, and I just want to highlight 3 tweets of his in particular. The first, USA taught me English one day and took my life from super miserable to very promising. Today, it droned my village, the most divided feeling ever. The second tweet says, Wasab, my village, is no doubt the most peaceful people and one of the poorest areas of Yemen. Congrats, you just made violence attractive to them. And finally, this country will need a group psychological therapy due to many terrifying things. Among them, US drones and president's silence. Here's a second user, Noon Arabia, also a citizen of Yemen. I'm going to pull up 3 pretty sort of representative tweets of hers. She says, you don't eradicate terrorism using terrorism. We launched a no drones campaign against soldiers playing video games with people's lives. We Yemenis are not anti-American, we are anti-drones, anti-extrajudicial killings, anti-extremism, anti-violence, and anti-terror. And finally, Dear Obama, when a US drone missile kills a child in Yemen, the father will go to war with you, guaranteed. And this is pretty indicative of the types of tweets that we saw. Obviously, there are tweets on both extremes. which if you're interested, I have the data, I'd be happy to share with you. But most of the users would say something to the effect of, hey, we don't hate the US, but we hate what you're doing, and here's the effect that it's having. In case you're wondering, we made word clouds of how these tweets were characterized based on whether they were written by Yemeni citizens or Americans. So these are all tweets about the Yemeni civil war, but separated by are you from Yemen or America. Big words mean they were used a lot, smaller words mean used less, colored by sort of the type. And as you look at these two word clouds, I want you to notice the differences in the way citizens of Yemen talk about the war in Yemen and the way Americans talk about the war in Yemen. As I read this, the American tweets read kind of like just a general list of words: time, people, news, media, report. But tweets from Yemeni citizens feel more personal. They talk about God. They talk about Yemen. They talk about places like Sana'a. As you might imagine, because the Yemeni civil war is more personal to them. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to focus on tweets about the Yemeni civil war from Yemeni citizens themselves and sort of filter out the American tweets. But as we started doing this, we started noticing on a large scale, wait a second, we started getting tweets like this. Here's a user whose geolocation is in Yemen, and they say, release the Yemen files, Hillary Clinton, Yemen crisis, Saudi, Iran, ISIL, AQAP, Red Sea. Here's the name of the link. And in fact, this person tweeted this, I think I cut it off, but something like 100 times. There's something else even more interesting if you can sort of squint your eyes and look at the time column. This user tweeted this every second for like 5 straight minutes. And I don't care how much of a Twitter fiend you are, it is not physically possible for a human to tweet that fast. And this is just one example of this, meaning it turns out that this sort of Twitter sphere was filled with many Twitter bots, which we had to account for in our analysis. And for those unfamiliar, Twitter bots are essentially just automated Twitter accounts operated by some kind of software, and that software controls what are you tweeting, what are you liking, what are you retweeting, who are you following, etc. So we wanted to see both, hey, we want to filter out bot tweets, but also, wait a second, what are these bots talking about? Can we quantify their prevalence? How are they trying to shape discourse, potentially? Also, we use a third-party service called Botometer, which essentially looks at an account, sees who they're following, sees what they're tweeting, looks at their activity, looks at things like, hey, they tweeted 500 times in 30 seconds, that's not humanly possible. Things like that, and gives a score to each user between 0 to 5, where 5 means you are definitely a bot, and 0 means you are definitely a human. And so we used this to categorize bots, and we compared tweets from bot accounts to human accounts. So that's our goal. And now it's time for some of the graphs. And this graph is pretty busy, so take a second to look at it. I'm going to break it down for us. On our x-axis, we have time. This is the year 2017, so we have months in time. These vertical bars are colored month by month based on the number of drone strikes in that month. So 12 bars, each showing, wow, in January, February, March of 2017, there were 16 drone strikes. And in April, there were 12. So lots of drone strikes here, not as many here, and then it picks back up over here. This white line is weekly number of tweets from Yemeni citizens about the Yemeni civil war. So what we theorized was, hey, when there are drone strikes, Yemeni citizens will be tweeting about the civil war. And so what we wanted to see is there a correlation, is there a relationship between tweeting, so this white line, and drone strikes? And if there were, what you would see is when there are lots of drone strikes, big spikes in this white curve here, big spikes in the number of tweets. And when there aren't that many drone strikes, like here, you wouldn't see big spikes. Not quite what we see here, but we'll keep digging. This is just one year. And I'm going to add to this bot tweets, so tweets from bots. which actually in the year 2017 did not make up a large proportion of tweets about the Yemeni civil war. These tweets from bots are this gray curve, and they're pretty small. On any given week, they make up less than 10% of the total tweets about the Yemeni civil war. All right, this graph's about to expand. Here is the entire length of the Yemeni civil war, at least up until we stopped our research, so it's still ongoing. Here is the beginning of, I guess, sort of the end of 2015, all the way through, and the screen comes off a little bit, but 2021. Again, vertical bars represent number of drone strikes. The white curve is how many tweets about the Yemeni civil war, and the gray curve represents tweets from bots. So take a second, look at this. Anybody see anything interesting they want to share? Any particular finding?
Wait, sorry, could you clarify, are the tweets related solely to drone strikes?
Yeah, good
or
question.
Anything
No, these are
to
any tweet related to the Yemeni civil war. So including drone strikes, but it could be about warring factions, AQAP, violence, anything that we could directly link to discussing the Yemeni civil war in any capacity.
So like in 2020, there's like 2 large peaks over here.
Yes.
I mean, people are talking about civil war, but it's not necessarily because there's drone strikes going on. It could
From
be-
this graph, you can't tell. All you can tell is, hey, in 2020, there seem to be these 2 really big spikes. Something is causing people to talk a lot about the Yemeni civil war. It turns out that the 2 biggest spikes, this one here in 2020 and this one here, are related to drone strikes. In fact, if you look at those tweets, almost every single one's about a drone strike. This one in particular was when the US hit a wedding procession with a drone strike, allegedly targeting some militant, although there was no confirmation that any militants were killed. I think it killed something like 12 civilians, all attending a wedding. That got a lot of news coverage, and there was a lot of tweeting about that. It turns out that there were many, many, many other drone strikes, some of which that killed more civilians, which we don't see spikes. Meaning, every now and then, there's this little correlation between a drone strike, or several of them, and people tweeting about it. But sometimes, like in this month, here we had 16 drone strikes, nothing. And you can visualize this in terms of fatalities too, if you want to look instead of number of drone strikes, how many people were killed. And we do see this same spike for this wedding procession I was talking about. But in these particular months, there were many, many, many fatalities, and there really wasn't a ton of Twitter discourse. Which is unfortunate. And of course, because I'm a statistician, I would be remiss if I didn't show you some things with p-values. So what I have here, if you haven't taken a stats class, plug your ears for a second, is we built a model trying to predict, hey, is having a drone strike, or the number of drone strikes, or the number of fatalities, is that predictive of high Twitter activity? Are more drone strikes, more fatalities, indicative of more tweets? And the answer is no, unequivocally no. There are no significant p-values here, and no matter how you chop up your model, there's no relationship here. And if you do it in any sort of lagged way, like, hey, is a drone strike last week predicting Twitter activity this week? Like maybe there's a delay between the strike and the Twitter activity, and the answer is no. In the same way, there's no relationship there. So there seems to be absolutely no relationship between drone strikes and massive tweeting about the drone strikes, despite us finding individual tweets talking about these strikes, which is kind of sad. And so what I want to sort of highlight is that despite the fact that thousands of users speak very personally, anecdotally, about the impact of drone strikes in their hometowns, this kind of discussion never picked up on Twitter. There was just all of this sort of overall discussion about the Yemeni civil war that had its peaks and troughs, but other than 2 very specific cases, people really weren't engaging in sort of a, what we call town square discussion about these drone strikes on Twitter. Essentially, tweets about specific events were drowned out in just the sea of AQAP does this, or the US does that, or Obama did this. Which is kind of sad. Twitter, which is the most popular form of social media in Yemen, just didn't serve as a place where people could engage in stories about drone strikes in their town. All right, now I gotta move to something a little bit happier. And the fact is a little bit happier is maybe a little sad. In my last couple of minutes, I'm gonna talk about necrotizing enterocolitis, which in and of itself is not happy, but some advancements that we're starting to make are. So I'm going to tell you about NEC in a second, but I have to give a big shout out to my collaborators. First, Tom Hayes, who works at Columbia in New York. Celine Everett, who was a student who graduated here a couple of years ago. She's now going to med school at UCSD. And Joseph, who is currently a student at Middlebury. They helped me both with literally everything, as Tom has, collect the data and analyze the data to make the graphs. So, what is necrotizing enterocolitis? Necrotizing is tissue dying. Enterocolitis means in the intestine. So tissue dying in the intestine, that's NEC. And NEC affects about 2 to 5% of premature births, depending on the data you have. We have lots of people working on data like this, and we get different estimates depending on what kind of data you use. It affects about 10% of babies born less than 3 pounds 4 ounces, which is about how much your laptop weighs. Laptop. It's responsible for a large chunk of the NICU admissions, so about 8%, which is non-trivial. And NEC involves you not getting enough blood or oxygen to the baby's intestines, which unfortunately causes holes in the intestines. The bacteria fill, bacteria release gases, the intestines die. So unfortunately NEC is unbelievably fatal. Up to 60% of babies die with NEC within the first 2 weeks of life. And despite lots of advancements in treating other issues, other illnesses, we haven't made a ton of progress treating NEC. Now, that being said, when we see in the clinic bloating or swelling of the belly, or if we see bloody feces, or if we take an abdominal x-ray and we notice, hey, there are holes in the intestines, there are some things you can do to an infant with NEC. You can treat the infant by using surgery to remove the damaged intestine, although oftentimes this has sort of lifelong effects, like especially when an infant is that young, removing intestines is not good, right? It leads to these sort of lifelong problems. You can use antibiotics to try and treat the bacterial infection. You have to do crazy things like feeding them in a way that bypasses the entire gastrointestinal tract. It's not good. So NEC is not good, and what causes it is, we have no idea. Legitimately no idea what actually causes this. Although we do know things that are incidental to it, things that seem to occur at the same time as NEC. Can't prove causality, but we know that in low birth weight, or small for gestational age infants, those who aren't breastfed have a higher incidence of NEC. So if you're breastfed and low birth weight, that seems to be correlated with low NEC. Doesn't mean that not breastfeeding causes NEC, but they seem to be related. Conditions which lower intestinal blood flow, like hypertension, preeclampsia, or drug use, like cocaine use, are linked with an increased incidence of NEC. Anything that's going to lower that blood flow. And finally, infants with anemia also have a higher incidence of NEC. Again, none of these things are causal, but they are related. So I want to show you what the data we have look like. The data that we have come from sort of 2 separate data sets. The first is a very large cohort of about 100,000 preterm infants from across 15 different NICUs. So some really passionate, amazing doctors spent about, I think it was like 25 years, going to, as you might imagine, all these different hospitals with totally different ways of keeping track of data, bringing it all together, merging it in an intelligent way, primarily on the East Coast of the US, and putting together this awesome data set. All of the infants you're going to see are premature, so we're going to cut that off before 36 weeks of gestation, and we have very basic information about the mother and the infant during pregnancy. There's also a second data set More sort of highly specialized, this is 164 preterm infants who are also low birth weight, and they were admitted to a single NICU where we collected more data, more features, more sort of intricate stuff about the infants. So the data looks something like this. Again, a massive spreadsheet with columns like, do they have NEC? What's the sex of the baby? Did they get the antenatal steroid betamethasone? Did they get a red blood cell infusion? Things like, were they breastfed, or did they get formula, or was it the mother's breast milk or donor breast milk? Some genetic information. Lots of different things that you might want to know about an infant. And our ultimate goal is to figure out what is causing NEC. So let's, in my sort of last 3 minutes, break down what the data look like to see if it gives us any clues. Thing one, almost every infant does not have NEC. This is good. We don't want our infants to have NEC, right? If you look at our data set, only about 4% of infants have NEC, and the vast majority don't. So this is good, but from a statistical standpoint, this means we don't have a lot of examples of infants having NEC. And unfortunately, death is a competing outcome with NEC, meaning oftentimes infants will die, and we don't know whether or not they had NEC or not, for a variety of reasons. And that complicates how we try and estimate, think about it. If we keep breaking down the data, and you have to remember or learn how to read a box plot, you're going to see that for infants with NEC, their gestational age tends to skew lower. So the box represents the middle 50% of gestational ages. And for infants without NEC, that middle 50% seems to be around 30 to 32 weeks. But for infants with NEC, that middle of the data seems to be about 25 to 29 weeks, with the median, this black bar, being 28 and 31. Meaning infants with NEC tend to be born more prematurely. If you do this in terms of birth weight, you see about the same thing. Infants with NEC tend to weigh less than infants without NEC. A couple more exploratory graphs. If you look at antenatal steroid, or I think this is all betamethasone use, you'll see that for most mothers, steroids are given, these antenatal steroids, and of the ones that are, it looks like maybe larger than this anyway, a larger proportion of them have NEC. But if you break this down proportionally, you'll see that proportionally, for mothers who have steroids, something like 6% of the infants have NEC, and for mothers not given steroids, something like 3% of those infants have NEC. I have one more of these for you. Looking at fetal Dopplers, or measuring heartbeat, you'll see that for infants that have an abnormal fetal Doppler, that's for premature infants, many of them, about 120 of them. For infants that have a normal fetal Doppler, it's about 44 of them. For the NEC infants, almost every single one had an abnormal heartbeat. Something pinged in the fetal Doppler. But for infants without NEC, most of them still had an abnormal fetal Doppler, but not quite as high a proportion. And so what the work here that I'm doing in collaboration with other people is trying to achieve is to say, we see all of these different things that seem to indicate, if you have an abnormal fetal Doppler, maybe that seems to be related to NEC. If the mother has antenatal steroids, maybe that seems to be related to NEC. If you're low for your gestational age, if you have low birth weight, maybe that seems to be related to NEC. Can I find some kind of causal link, and can I find some way to put all of this information together in a way where I can identify if an infant is likely to have NEC or not? Because if they do, I have to act quickly. But the way that I act is invasive, it's costly, and so I can't afford to do this for every infant. Can I find some way of achieving this? And the super short version, which I'm going to zoom through to the end, is sort of. Here, I have what's called a confusion matrix, which says, on the left, does the actual infant have NEC or not? And on the columns, I have what does my, as it turns out, random forest model predict that the infant has. And the best thing we can do, so sort of the conclusion here, the best we can possibly do is to say, hey, I'm going to make a prediction using all these variables I just told you, and if I look at all of the infants with NEC, I'm actually correctly predicting most of them. Meaning, if I look at all 4.3% of infants with NEC, my model is capturing the majority of them. But my model is also making a lot of false positive predictions. This 31% means that 31% of the time, I've got an infant without NEC, but I'm predicting they haven't. And what this means is our current models for predicting NEC can catch most babies with NEC, but they have a really high false positive rate. And these kinds of tests are reasonable. Mammograms, for example, are fantastic, but they have about 50% false positive rate. We would really love to get a 50% false positive rate. We're closer to about 90% right now. And so the goal of future work is to figure out how can we dig deeper in these data sets, find some sort of causal links, and better understand how we can eke out a couple extra percentage points to identify all the babies we can that are going to get NEC, give them the treatment they need, and save resources where we can. So, to zoom past this, thank you so much for listening. So I zoom past all of my explanation. Boom. Thank you. I've left a grand total of 3 minutes for questions. If you have to leave, please feel free to leave now. Does anybody have any questions? Go for it, Carrie.
When you were doing the gaze data,
Yeah.
how did you take into account students looking at the axes and reading that and interpreting it?
Yeah, good question. So the short answer is we have, so there's lots of different ways you can pull apart the gaze data. One is to include looking at axes. Another is to say, instead of looking at saccades, I'm just going to look at areas of interest. Meaning I'm going to encode the entire y-axis as a particular area of interest and see, calculate a dwell time. Like how much time are they spending on that axis? And the super long story short is, what we found is that students, the second time they look at a graph, just in general, dwell less. They spend less time looking at the axes. You can assume that's for a lot of reasons. One is, hey, I've seen a graph like this, I don't need to look as much. But what we found is that that wasn't as predictive. There weren't as big of differences other than total dwell time between the first time they saw it and the second time they saw it. So they're still looking at the axes a reasonable amount of time, but the first time they're really scanning, and the second time it happens very quickly. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Sorry, do you think if they had different axes in the second graph, they would spend the same amount of time as they did in the first?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have the data to test that, but I don't know the answer. We had 25 different tasks. I have not had time to analyze all of them, and so that could be answered. Yeah.
When you showed them the second image, was it the one where that was like kind of a flipped version where like
They didn't, yeah, correct. They saw it as the, if I go all the way back. Zoom back, here we go. No, it's not gonna work. There we go. Go all the way back. They saw, stop it. They saw this, right? So the first time they literally saw this, the second time they literally saw this, but when I did my machine learning, when I actually looked at the data, I mirrored it to make sure that that movements across the graphing area would match up. Which kind of gets back to Kira's point, because it actually becomes a little bit harder to encode as they move from the 16 to the top bar, or from the 16 to the top bar. Those saccades actually look very different. So you'd have to take a different approach to sort of handle
Did you like switch, like for like part of the people, like got the second image first?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
correct. Yeah, we randomized the order they got that. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I have time for one more question. Go for it.
What kind of future work do you see yourself doing with this?
Sure. I mean, in some sense, there are still tons of data, so tons of other tasks that just that elicit interesting things. Like there's tons of information on different strategies students take to solve questions. Here I'm just looking at graphs, but we ask them different questions like, describe this in context, or which graph has more variation. So there's work there. But also this interview data is super rich, where you ask students, hey, tell me about how you solved this question. And then sort of matching up, when I see, oh, they're looking like this, they must be using this strategy, is what they're saying they did actually matching up with what I'm inferring? And the super short answer is, we don't know yet. So it's sort of matching that, because I can say, look, there's definitely a difference in the gaze data, but I can't yet say for sure why. And that would help answer the question of why. Like, what are they actually doing different? Awesome. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. Feel free to help yourself to food on the way out. Thanks for coming.